Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Burns. I'm the program director with Sky Island Alliance. For those of you who may be new to our organization, we are a conservation group that works in Mexico and the US across the entire Sky Island region. We focus on protecting the diversity of life and lands in this region, and we use conservation science and restoration techniques to make this keep this place the most amazing place that it can be. Want to acknowledge that our work is done on Indigenous land, both in Mexico and in the US. I'm speaking to you today from Tucson, which is the traditional homeland of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui and other Indigenous people. Today, during the webinar, you have the ability to send messages to hosts and panelists, and we'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have any burning questions, if you have comments or need any technical help, you can send us direct messages in the chat, which is a button located at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you would like to enable a transcript to read of what's being said during this webinar, we're going to post a link to a tutorial about how you can pull that up using the show captions option at the bottom of your screen. You can also enlarge the font of the chat and moderate, but kind of buffer any bright lights or things that might show up on your screen. So please take advantage of that if you'd like to change any of your own accessibility settings here in Zoom. So with that, I'm just really thrilled to be able to have this conversation today with Marit Alanen, and I'm going to pass it over to her in a moment. But just wanted to start with saying how important Jaguar is to our organization and to our region. The conservation and restoration work that we do is on a landscape that we refer to as Path of the Jaguar, which is really the literal and the metaphorical place where jaguar moves across this region. And when we do right by the jaguar, when we provide safe passage, when we protect and then restore where needed the habitat that jaguar needs to thrive, we're not only saving this iconic cat, but we're doing so many wonderful things for the wide variety of species that call this region home. We're so grateful to the Wilberforce Foundation and Carol Petrie Foundation for supporting our work for jaguar and other species across the border. So thank you so much. Now with that, I just can't wait to hear what Marit has to say. And so I'm going to pass the baton to her. She's the lead biologist and expert for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on jaguar and a liaison to the Jaguar Recovery Team. She was involved in its development. So she is the best resource to learn everything there is to know about the regulatory environment in which jaguar lives today. So with that, Marit, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate being invited to the coffee break today. The story of the jaguar dates back 50 years, if not longer. And it's a story that I enjoy telling people because there's a lot to it. And I look forward to giving this presentation to everybody who's able to attend today. So as Emily said, my name is Marit Alanen. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Arizona Ecological Services Office, based out of Tucson myself. And I have been the lead biologist for the jaguar for over half my career. I've been a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service for almost 19 years. The jaguar entered my life in 2011, and it has not left since then. So I'm happy to be able to share the story of the jaguar, the regulatory story of the jaguar with you today. So to begin, let's step back a little bit in time. Let's go back to the 1960s. This was a time when the American public began to realize that we were losing our natural resources. And things like Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson. This was a book documenting the indiscriminate use of pesticides and their effects on the environment, particularly on birds. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire, and not the first time that it had caught fire. And Lake Erie was considered dead because of pollutants that contributed to eutrophication that then had massive fish kills everywhere. So it's in this environment that the American public asked Congress to do something about that. And they did. In 1973, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act, which was signed into law by President Nixon. And the purpose of this law is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which threatened and endangered species depend may be conserved. A pretty lofty goal. It's a lofty law. It's administered primarily by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, although the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration administers some marine mammals as well as species in the ocean. And there can be some confusion, weirdness with some species like sea turtles, for instance. NOAA administers them when they're in the water. Fish and Wildlife Service administers them when they're on land. So we do a lot of coordination between the agencies. The Endangered Species Act is divided into sections, which are essentially like chapters. And the one that we're going to focus on today is Section 4, which is the determination of endangered and threatened species status, or threatened species. It's a very beefy section. It has a lot in it, including adding species to the endangered species list, or changing their status, like from going from threatened to endangered, which is uplisting, or going from endangered to threatened, which is downlisting, or going from downlisting to removing, which is delisting the species. It also talks about designating critical habitat, recovery planning, and monitoring. And so we will be looking at the first three of these four things, looking at them through the lens of the jaguar. Now, when you start talking about laws, you quickly realize that words are very important. And so I have put up the definition of critical habitat here with a few modifications, but that comes straight out of the Endangered Species Act, specifically Section 3.5a, which you can see at the bottom. And so how critical habitat is defined is the secretary, and this means the Secretary of the Interior, which is the department within which the Fish and Wildlife Service is a part, or the Secretary of Commerce, which is where NOAA exists. So the Secretary, to the maximum extent prudent and determinable, shall designate any habitat of such species, which is then considered to be critical habitat, and may, from time to time thereafter as appropriate, revise such designation. So the important word that I want you to note here is the word shall. It doesn't say that the Secretary may designate critical habitat or can designate critical habitat when time and resources allow. It says shall, which means it must be done. But what is the saying? All rules are made to be broken. So there are a couple of exceptions to designating critical habitat at the time that I was working on this. So we're hearkening back to 2011, 2012, 2013, that period of time. And those exceptions were that critical habitat was not prudent if the species is threatened by taking and other human activity, and identification of critical habitat can be expected to increase the degree of threat. So a good example of this would be, for instance, a plant. If you have plants on the ground and you draw a polygon around them and say, hey, this is critical habitat, people are probably pretty sure that they can find those plants within that polygon. And if those plants happen to be threatened by collection or illegal trade or something of that nature, putting that polygon on a map could increase that threat of collection or illegal trade. So that would be an example of why we would not want to designate critical habitat. The other example is that, or the other situation is that such designation of critical habitat would not be beneficial to the species. And this is a pretty high bar, because one can consider that even proposing critical habitat could benefit the species because it increases awareness of that species. And so to say that there's no benefit is actually kind of difficult. And these exceptions are taken from what we call the Code of Federal Regulations. You can see the 50 CFR 424 down at the bottom. And what the Code of Federal Regulations are is the regulations that the agencies develop to help them implement the laws that Congress passes. Because sometimes, maybe oftentimes, these laws they don't have all the detail that we need to actually implement them, or they're a little vague, or they don't provide definitions for some terms. And so then it's up to the agency to determine what Congress intended and try to come up with regulations that help implement that law. And those regulations mostly go out for public comment, so the public has a chance to weigh in on them, and then they become sort of finalized. And so these were from the CFR at the time, in 2011, 2012, and these were the exceptions that we were working under. So let's dive in to the Jaguars listing history. How did it end up on the Endangered Species Act? Because it's kind of complicated. So the jaguar was actually listed under the Endangered Species Conservation Act of 1969, which predates the Endangered Species Act. But what you can see here is that it was added as a foreign endangered species and listed in as being endangered in Central and South America. So I guess at that point, we felt like we didn't have jaguars in the US anymore. We had done a pretty good job of extirpating them in this country. But what's curious to me is they seem to have forgotten that Mexico might have some jaguars. So in any case, there was kind of a question here. In 1973, the ESA supersedes the ESCA. And then in 1975, what used to be two separate lists, one for native species and one for foreign, were combined and into one big list. And again, you can see that we said that the jaguar was listed in Central and South America. So there's this question remaining out there, like, what happens if a jaguar is found in the United States? Is it protected? In 1979, we published a notice in the Federal Register. And if you're not aware what the Federal Register is, it's the place where the federal government publishes all of the things that they're working on, their proposed rules, their notices, final rules, things like that. And it's currently, you can find it online, but every day there's a new Federal Register that's published. And so in 1979, we published this notice that said, hey, we made a mistake. It was an oversight that we didn't include jaguars as being listed in the United States, and we'll try to fix that as quickly as we can. So in 1980, we published a proposed rule to list the jaguar in the US. But then for some reason, we weren't able to complete that within a couple of years. And in 1982, that rule was withdrawn, in part because, as it says here, the ESA mandates that it's withdrawn, if not final, after 2 years, and that's correct. But then also 1982 was the last year that substantial changes were made to the ESA. For instance, habitat conservation plans were added as a tool to the ESA then, and there were other tweaks that were made to the law. So I think the thought at that time was that let's wipe the slate clean, let's start fresh, and anything that wasn't completed by 1982, we'll restart, and so that we can incorporate all of these new tweaks that might have happened. So a decade later, we were petitioned to list the jaguar again in the US. We found that petition to be substantial and warranted. And then in 94, we proposed a rule to extend that status into the US. Usually it would take us about a year to then finalize that rule. But in 1995, Congress enacted a moratorium that prohibited all work on listing actions. So we couldn't do anything because Congress was prohibiting it. So it took a year before the president lifted that moratorium. And at that time, we then resumed the process after the Center for Biological Diversity sued us on that. And then finally, in 1997, we published a final rule clarifying the endangered status of the jaguar in the US. Now, usually when we list a species, we are supposed to designate critical habitat at the same time. I'm not going to say that happens all the time. The two processes can be very involved, and so we often split them and do listing first and then critical habitat, but there are times where we are able to do them together. In this case, what we said in 1997 was that critical habitat was not prudent because publication of detailed maps would increase the threats to the jaguar. Now, recall back to those two exceptions that we had in the Code of Federal Regulations, one of which was creating maps could increase that threat to jaguars. So that's the first exception, and we're invoking that here. Folks did not agree with us, and we went to court again. And in this case, in 2006, we agreed to look at that prudency determination. And at this time, then we said, well, it's not prudent because no areas in the US met the definition of critical habitat, and therefore there was no benefit. Now, remember, I said that no benefit thing was a high bar to have to reach. And so again, we were sued, we were in court, and the court basically said, no, you need to look at the principal biological constituent elements that are essential to the conservation of the species. So we've used both of those exceptions. We've been told by the court each time that it's not valid. So in 2010, we determined that designation of critical habitat was prudent, which means we need to designate critical habitat. And this is about the time where I became involved with the jaguar. And, you know, in my mind, the jaguar is like a jungle cat, you know, its strongholds are the Pantanal of Brazil and Belize. And so what is it in the United States that they are keying in on? Because one thing about critical habitat is that we can only designate it in the US. We don't designate critical habitat in other countries. So we really had to focus on what's happening here in the US. So to tackle that, or to, what is the phrase? To eat an elephant, you take one bite at a time. So in trying to eat this elephant, we had to go back to the words that are in the law itself. So how is critical habitat defined again in the law? So there are two parts to it basically, and we're going to focus on the first part here primarily, and then I'll tell you about the second part. So the first part is specific areas within the geographical area that are occupied by the species at the time it is listed, on which are found the physical or biological features that are essential to the conservation of the species and may require special management considerations or protection. So that's a lot. And really, to try to eat this elephant, we had to take one bite at a time. So the first piece that we tackled was at the time it is listed. Now, for most species, that is generally pretty obvious. You have a listing date, and that's the time it's listed. For the jaguar, however, it's a little more confusing because if you recall back to the timeline, it was listed as endangered under the ESCA in 1972, but it was saying that it was a foreign species. Then it was superseded in 1973, but again, it was considered a foreign species. So is it protected in the US? And then in 1997, we finalized the rule saying, yes, it is endangered in the US. So you could develop a valid argument for any one of these three dates. What we relied on was this notice that we published in 1979 saying that it was a mistake. We meant to list the jaguar throughout its whole range when we listed it. And so that meant that we chose 1972 as the official date of listing. Okay, so we've figured out that piece of the puzzle. The second piece that we tackled is, what does occupied by the species mean? Because again, we're going back in time here. Nobody's looking for jaguars in 1972. So how are we even going to determine where jaguars were at that time? So what we did was we considered the average lifespan of the jaguar, which is about 10 years. And we decided to include any records that were from 1962 to 1982. So, 10 years on either side of that 1972 date. We also said that jaguars were rare. They were very secretive. They're difficult to detect, and nobody was looking for them at that time. So we then also said that we would include records from 1982 to the present, which was, again, at that time, 2011, 12, 13, because they indicate areas that were likely occupied at the time of listing in 1972. So the time frame within which we are considering records as being occupied at the time of listing is from 1962 to the present. Okay, so we figured out that piece. The next piece is, well, what actually is a record of a jaguar? And fortunately, there's a way to classify records um, that include sort of the level of evidence involved with them. So the first one is class 1, and this is kind of considered the best evidence because there's physical evidence to go with it. This could be a skin, a skull, a photo, a video, DNA, something that actually says that is definitely a jaguar or whatever X species it might be. Class 2 evidence is detailed information, but no physical evidence. So this could be perhaps like a researcher who studies jaguars, sees one, but doesn't have a camera ready to take a photo. So somebody who's knowledgeable can provide a lot of information about it. That's considered class 2. And then all the other things we consider class 3. These are secondhand reports. Somebody heard somebody else say they saw a jaguar, or perhaps somebody who hasn't necessarily seen a lot of jaguars in the wild says they saw one in kind of an unusual location and there's no proof of it. So that would be class 3. When we were considering evidence for critical habitat, we wanted to be as accurate as possible. So we only considered class 1 evidence, class 1 records as the records of events that we would consider for occupied at the time of listing. All right, so we figured that part out. So now again, we get to the physical or biological features, which, what are those things in the United States? We just, I don't know. And fortunately for me, the year before, in 2010, we had convened the binational US and Mexico Jaguar Recovery Team. And this is a team made up of people, roughly equal representation from the US and Mexico, that's divided into 2 subgroups. There's the technical subgroup that are the species experts, the feline ecologists, conservation biologists, who really know and understand how, like, what the jaguar needs to be able to get to recovery for the species. The other group is the implementation subgroup, and they're the landowners, land managers from agencies and private entities who are the folks who then can understand how to apply the recovery actions on the ground, like land management activities and other things that would go into implementing those recovery actions that the technical subgroup comes up with. Part of what they wanted to do was figure out what makes up high quality habitat in the Northwestern Recovery Unit. And I'll talk more about this unit when we get to the recovery part of this talk. You can see it in the map on the left. It's this area that goes from southern Arizona and New Mexico down to Jalisco. And the recovery team said that there were these 8 factors that are really important to the jaguar. And then to be able to map them, they needed to look for data layers that would apply to these factors. So they found data layers for 5 of them. Some of these layers, they're just not available, like no poaching. I don't know how you'd get a data layer for that because that is so variable. It can change so quickly. You don't really have an accurate representation of that you could feed into this model. Even things like prey, like every prey item for a jaguar would need its own habitat model. So you've got models upon models upon models. So, and that can change pretty quickly too. So they took these five data layers and combined them with 333 georeferenced jaguar sightings that were gleaned from the literature that's out there. So publicly available. The Wildlife Conservation Society was contracted to do this work, and they looked through literature dating back to the time of Coronado. So that's probably the first reference of a jaguar in the New World was from 1540. So they took all of these georeferenced jaguar sightings and combined them with these data layers such that where every sighting was, you could get sort of what that data layer was underneath it. Like what is the level of tree cover they're looking for? How rugged is it? And so you can see what they determined in this first run of that model as being important to jaguars. They like some cover, 3 to 60% tree cover. They like rugged areas based on this model. They want to be within a certain distance of water. They don't like a lot of human influence, and the HII is the human influence index, rather. And what it is it's data layer that encompasses the entire world that's broken up into 1 square kilometer pixels. And within each square kilometer, that pixel is assigned a number based on the level of human influence. And that's like road densities, ports, railroads, human density, stable nighttime lighting, things that sort of show human development. And the scale goes from 0, no human influence, up to 64, which is the most impacted areas. And so you can see jaguars are like less than half of that. And so they're kind of avoiding these human influenced landscapes. And then they also brought in a few World Wildlife Fund ecoregions. That's a layer that covers both the United States and Mexico. And so we could pull out some of those habitat types that jaguars seem to be gravitating towards. What this meant for me then was that I could take this model and tweak it to make it specific to the United States when I'm thinking about critical habitat in the US. And so I modified these habitat features using 130 undisputed Class 1 records just within the US. And again, within that window of time, 1962 to the present, because that's how we defined occupied at the time of listing. So in that analysis, some of the factors changed a little bit. They seemed to need less tree cover here, same amount of ruggedness, still within a distance of water, less tolerant of humans in this northern part of their range. And then because we were just focused on the US, we could use a vegetation layer that was a little better. And so we determined that they really seem to prefer madrean evergreen woodland and semi-desert grassland areas. So that was the first part of critical habitat. I said there was a second part too. And the other part of designating critical habitat are these areas that are outside the occupied areas that are essential for the conservation of the species. So when we were thinking about this part of critical habitat, we had multiple documents in the past saying how important connectivity to Mexico was. So that is what we looked at when we were thinking about unoccupied but essential habitat. And unoccupied areas don't need to contain any of those vegetation characteristics that I just mentioned that occupied areas need to have. But for us to figure out where those places were on the landscape, we did choose to use a combination of vegetation and or topography, plus that low human influence, since it seemed really important to the jaguar in this part of its range. And this is what the first proposed jaguar critical habitat map looked like. There are 6 units. This is in southern Arizona. Tucson is just off the map where I-19 and I-10 converge in sort of the northwestern part of the map. And the red areas are what we consider to be occupied at the time of listing. So those are the polygons that contain all of those habitat features that were determined to be important, plus at least one Class 1 record of a jaguar between 1962 and the present. The black polygons are what we would call the unoccupied areas. They don't have to contain those habitat features. They do happen to have a couple of them, and they don't have any records of jaguars in them. And so you can see that in the far west in the Babrakivari Mountains of Unit 1, there's a black polygon that connects that occupied unit to Mexico. And then in Unit 4, the Whetstone Mountains, there are 2 black polygons that connect it to Unit 3, which then provides connectivity to Mexico. So we published this in August of 2012. And at that time, we opened it up for public comment. We received 156 comments. And then in March of 2013, we received an updated report from the Jaguar Recovery Team where they had redone this model and refined those modeling variables, which meant we had to consider it, because the whole reason we assembled the recovery team was to provide us with the best available information. And that's a requirement in the Endangered Species Act. We must use the best available data. And so we had to consider this. It's the best available data that we have. So we reran our models, and some of those numbers that I showed on the previous slide were tweaked a little bit. And we published that revised proposed rule in July of 2013. At this point, we got over 33,000 comments, and we got even more comments at a public hearing that we held. One thing to note about the timing is, again, we're supposed to have a year to finalize critical habitat after we've proposed it. So if you look again at the timeline, proposed it in August 2012. Here we are in July of 2013. We've just gotten 33,000 comments, and we're supposed to publish it in a month. So fortunately, a smart person asked the court if we could have an extension, and they gave us till December 16th. So that was good. That gave us the opportunity to open up the public comment period again, because some people said it wasn't long enough. They needed more time. So we got more comments then. And then in October of 2013, the government shut down. This particular furlough was, I think, 16 or 17 days. And if you're not aware of what happens during a furlough, it is any government employee that's considered non-essential cannot work. We can't use government resources. We can't go to our offices. We can't boot up our computers, use our phones. We were shut down. We cannot work on stuff. And like during this time, the contract with the folks who were doing the economic analysis expired during those 17 days. So even when we came back, it was like a big ship just to get things moving again and get back on track. So once again, went to the court, asked for a new date, and they gave us till Valentine's Day of 2014, but they were very clear in saying, do not ask us again. This is it. You must deliver it to the Federal Register by that point. And we did. We made it, I think, a couple of days early, but it kind of stayed in the Federal Register for a little while. It published on March 5th of 2014 and became effective a month later. And then we also applied a couple of things in the Endangered Species Act where we exempted Fort Huachuca, which is that brown area that's been cut out in the Huachuca Mountains, and we excluded the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is the sort of tan area in the Babar-Kibri Mountains on the western side. I won't go into those. Also, in case you're not aware of what the Federal Register is, did I already talk about this? It's where we publish all these things. And so our goal was just to get this notice to the Federal Register by that date. And then it was up to the Federal Register to publish it. Okay, so you'd think that maybe, cool, we're done. It's final. Let's move forward. But no. One of the things that the Endangered Species Act allows is for citizen lawsuits to be brought against some of the decisions that the Fish and Wildlife Service makes under the Endangered Species Act. So in 2015, in May of that year, the New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau, cattle growers, and Federal Lands Council sued us in the New Mexico District Court to overturn jaguar critical habitat in New Mexico. And their argument was that New Mexico was not occupied when the jaguar was listed, and that it was not essential for jaguar conservation. So harken back to, remember that whole discussion of occupied at the time of listing. That's the thing they're arguing here, as well as our explanation of why these areas were essential. In October of 2017, the New Mexico District Court denied that petition. Basically, they ruled in favor of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The plaintiffs appealed, so Farm and Livestock Bureau, cattle growers, they all appealed that. Then in March of 2020, the appellate court reverses that original decision and then remands that decision back to the New Mexico District Court to figure out how to fix it. They said, you're wrong, we agree with the plaintiffs in this case. So basically the opposite of what the New Mexico District Court had decided. So that means that the New Mexico District Court then orders us to comply with that court order and to remove New Mexico lands from jaguar critical habitat. So we published a new map, and here you can see that we've removed all lands within New Mexico. So that was critical habitat at the time of July 2021. But wait, there's more. In September of 2017, the Center for Biological Diversity sued us in the Arizona District Court on our biological opinion for the Rosemont mine, which, if you're not aware, is a large mine that's going in the Santa Rita Mountains It's within Jaguar critical habitat, and there was a jaguar that had been sighted there between 2012 and 2015. CBD claims that the mine would destroy jaguar critical habitat. So in December of that year, the Rosemont mine answers that claim, but at the same time also files a cross-claim against us, challenging the designation of critical habitat in the northern Santa Rita Mountains of Unit 3 and then Subunit 4, which is one of those unoccupied units that connects two units together, basically the Rosemont mine area. And they argued that it wasn't essential to jaguar conservation and that Unit 4B lacks the physical and biological features essential for jaguar conservation. Now, remember, Unit 4B is one of those unoccupied units, so technically it doesn't need to have those physical and biological features. But regardless, this is what they were saying. In February of 2020, the Arizona District Court rules against Rosemont's cross-claim. So again, in our favor, Rosemont appeals that. Then during that process, that's continuing, Rosemont pursues another method of revising critical habitat by petitioning us to revise it. And again, they wanted sort of the same thing, like remove those areas of the northern Santa Rita Mountains. We went through that process. That's a whole separate thing outside of the court system. And we completed a finding stating that the petition didn't provide substantial scientific information that would warrant that revision. So we published that in September of 2021. And then the court case sort of got finalized, finished up in May of 2023. And the appellate court affirmed part of what the district court said and then also reversed part of it and then remanded it back to the district court. And so then the district court ordered us to comply with that. So, and that meant that we needed to basically get rid of that portion of Unit 3 and all of Subunit 4B that Rosemont had sued us over. So we are in that process still right now. That will be something that we will comply with, and that will be published in the Federal Register. So keep an eye out. And that's not all. In December of 2022, the Center for Biological Diversity petitioned us for two things. One was to establish an experimental population of jaguars in the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, and at the same time, expand jaguar critical habitat into the Mogollon Plateau of Arizona and New Mexico. So that map looks like this. The green polygons that are labeled 1 and 2 are that expansive area in the Mogollon Plateau. They also asked that we add those areas that were removed from New Mexico back in, as well as add in the other sky islands that are found in New Mexico and southern Arizona. We had to split those two things into two separate ways of handling them because they involve different processes. So regarding the experimental population, we sent a letter just last month to CBD explaining how in our analysis of looking at an experimental population, we determined that doing that would not be sufficient to further recovery of the species. And there's an entire process we go through when we're looking at putting a new population on the ground. And it's all detailed in the letter that we sent. And I'm sure you can find that online. And I can also share it if you want. So that we sent back to them in January. Then regarding the critical habitat portion of it, we are completing another finding on that petition to expand it, and that will also be published in the Federal Register. So keep an eye out for that one too. All right, so that was a quick summary of 50 years of the Jaguar. Let me grab a quick drink and then we will dive into recovery. Okay, so what is recovery? Recovery is the process of restoring endangered and threatened species in the wild to the point where they no longer require the protection of the Endangered Species Act. A recovery plan then serves as the roadmap that we use to achieve species recovery. And what's interesting about recovery plans is that they're non-regulatory. So that means you don't have to implement them. They're simply a guidance document that helps us understand the best path forward trying to achieve recovery for the species, because ultimately that's the goal of the Endangered Species Act, is to recover species and get them off the list. For the Jaguar Recovery Plan, like I mentioned before, we had assembled the binational Jaguar Recovery Team in 2010. And over the course of 8 years, we were able to create this recovery plan. The final, it was in July of 2018. It's available online. It's pretty beefy. Lots of pages in that thing. And one of the first questions that the recovery team had to consider when they were developing this plan, and part of the reason it took, a long time, is like, what were we actually going to include in the plan? Because the extremes of those possibilities could be just the borderlands area, like jaguars at the far northern edge of their range, or it could be all the range of the jaguar from the United States down to Argentina. And what the recovery team determined and decided to do is to split the jaguar's range into 2 recovery units, both of which are essential to the conservation of the species. So one of the recovery units is the Northwestern Recovery Unit, which you saw before, and it extends from the US through Sonora, Sinaloa, Nayarit, and Jalisco. And it is and this is the recovery unit that the team felt we could have the most impact in. We have great partnerships with Mexico. We can work with them to achieve recovery actions in this unit much more easily than trying to do these projects throughout the entire Jaguars range. So everything outside of the NRU is the Pan American Recovery Unit, or the PARU. So you can see that here, everything in green on this particular map. And regarding that map, we do, because the jaguar is considered one species throughout its whole range, we do need to still have recovery actions. We still need to sort of try to offset the threats to them. So we have recovery actions in the plan that speak to that. It's more about encouraging good things for jaguars in the PARU, and then there's more defined recovery actions for the NRU. The recovery unit in the NRU it's divided into different subunits. So you have the core areas, which have the strongest evidence of jaguar populations and records of persistent jaguar occurrence and reproduction. So you have the Sonora core area and the Jalisco core area. Then we have the secondary areas, which have habitat and some historical or recent records of jaguars, but no recent or very few records of reproduction. So there you can see the Sinaloa secondary area, which connects the 2 core areas, and then the borderlands secondary area, which also includes a portion of the US. These connectivity is a big deal. So the Sinaloa secondary area is important for that reason, but it's, this borderland secondary area is part of the recovery unit. So that's also still important for the jaguar. The recovery plan itself has, it's got recovery criteria, objectives, recovery actions, all of which are that roadmap, again, to recovering the jaguar. One of those actions was to develop the Jaguar Observations Database, which I mentioned that the Wildlife Conservation Society had, gathered all of these records dating back hundreds of years, but they weren't accessible. They were in an access database. And so, again, at the request of the Jaguar Recovery Team, they converted it to this online platform, which I'm going to touch on really quickly because I think it's a really helpful place for folks to go if you have questions about sightings of jaguars. And it's a very powerful database too. So here's the splash page. If you click on the Getting Started tutorial, you will see there's a few videos that you can watch, and they will help explain this far better than I will attempt to do right now. But we're going to dive into Begin Exploring. And this is what will pop up. What you see on the screen right now is basically what we kind of consider the class 1 records that are in that database. But you can also get to the equivalent of class 2 and class 3, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But one thing I wanted to explain here is a lot of people just focus on these point locations, but it's really important to look at these polygons as well, because they are also locations of jaguars. It's just that the information that we have about that sighting is at a greater scale. It's, a jaguar in the Chiricahuas, a jaguar in the whetstones, and we don't know exactly within that mountain range where that jaguar is located. So instead, we indicate it with a polygon. So for instance, if we click on the whetstones here, you can see that there have been 3 sightings of a jaguar in the whetstones. 2011, Donnie Fenn was a mountain lion hunter, and he treated a jaguar and has a whole bunch of photos of it. And if you click on more information about that, the more detailed explanation of that sighting pops up. So here you can see the summary at the top of that information, but then here are all of the sources of information specific to that sighting. You can see how many times it was quoted in different articles or papers or personal communications or whatever. So you can click on any one of these and then see what information was provided in that source. And there's just, a ton of information. Some of it has more info in certain sections, some of it has less. So it's just everything that we know about that particular sighting based on these sources. What these sources also have then is a link to a library next to them, which if you click on it will take you to this Zotero library, where it will provide you with information about that particular source. So here, in this case, it was an email. The date of that email. In some cases, if it's a paper that's available online, there will be a URL link for it. And so it's a really good way to kind of dive down into the information that's in here. I do need to do a little work on the Zotero database. Not all the links are working as they should, but just the general concept there. So yeah, pay attention to all of that. And then again, one of the best features of this database is that, again, I said this was like class 1 stuff, but you can go in and you can select whatever filters you want in this database. So for instance, right now, we just have these checked as the default, but let's say you want to see everything that's of these various types of observations, and you want all the different ranges of dates that you can possibly have. So, more than a century, but less than a millennium. Identity right now, it's just jaguar, but hey, let's see what everything is for all of these other identities. Location, we'll just add all those, and evidence as well. And then when you search again, you will see the difference in what pops up. So now there's even something down here. But if you look at the map again, you can see there are these large polygons for these other sightings. So you can again click on that and view and see what type of sighting it is, and look at, dive down into that information. So once you've created a filter that you like, you can then export it as well. And it'll export as a CSV file. You can pull it up into Excel, and then you can do with that data what you want, your own analyses. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's a really helpful tool. I try to keep it updated as quickly as I can. It kind of depends on workload, and it also depends on the information that's shared with me. So if I don't have information, then I obviously won't be putting it in there. And I know we're running a little short on time, so I am going to click back to the presentation and end it there. And again, thank you for letting me talk to everybody during this coffee break.
Oh, thank you so much, Marit. That was fascinating. And the twists and turns, I mean, it's just incredible how much has happened over the last few decades. And I can echo what we're seeing in the chat, that people are very appreciative of the thorough presentation that you've given. So thank you so much.
Great. It was a pleasure. Thank you.